Live from New Delhi, you're watching DD India, Voice to the World. And we will get you exclusive coverage when we talk of the G20 summit. The world watches as India will be hosting the 18th G20 summit today. And we have been tracking getting you extensive coverage of the run-up of the meetings which have been taking place. Close to 200 meetings in 60 locations for the past close to 1 year. And today, when the event actually takes place, we'll get you live action. All the reporting from our reporters who are specially stationed there at the swanky new Bharat Mandapam at Pragati Maidan. We'll keep you updated. Stay with us. I'm Preeti. With me is Anil.
Good morning, India. Good morning, Preeti. Well, it's going to be a power-packed next 248 hours that we look forward to. India hosting the 18th edition of G20, and it's going to be filled with lots of buzz. We are going to get you all the buzz as it breaks on Ground Zero. Our team of reporters all across the venues in the national capital, the Bharat Mandapam, as Preeti put it. We're going to get it news as it breaks here on DD India and DD News. I'm Anil Thomas. Let's get started this Saturday morning, the opening day of the 18th edition of G20, with the headlines that we are tracking at the top of this hour.
The 18th G20 Leaders Summit begins here in New Delhi in just a couple of hours from now.
Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and US President Joe Biden say they are working to strengthen ties across all dimensions after Friday night's bilateral meeting.
The 18th G20 summit begins today here in New Delhi. The summit is the culmination of a series of ministerial and working group meetings that took place in the past year. Several issues ranging from food to energy security to clean energy transition and climate change will be discussed at length by the world's leading economies during the two-day event. More than 30 heads of state and top officials from the European Union, invited guest countries, and 14 heads of international organizations are in attendance.
Well, on the sidelines of the G20 meeting, Prime Minister Modi continued to hold bilateral meetings with world leaders. The delegation is expected to further deepen the bonds of friendship and cooperation. On Friday, Prime Minister Modi held bilateral meetings with US President Joe Biden at his official residence in Delhi. During the meeting, both leaders discussed a wide range of issues to further economic and people-to-people linkages between the two countries. Prime Minister Modi expressed confidence that the friendship between the two nations will continue to play a great role in furthering global good. US President reiterated the support for India's permanent membership in a reformed UN Security Council.
And up next, we get you some of the key takeaways from the Modi-Biden bilateral meeting that took place yesterday. Joe Biden has welcomed a request from India's Defense Ministry to procure 31 drones from the United States. In a joint statement, the two leaders reaffirmed the importance of Quad in supporting, quote, a free, open, inclusive and resilient Indo-Pacific. The two men called on their governments to continue transforming the Indo-US strategic partnership across all dimensions. Narendra Modi and Joe Biden reaffirmed their commitment to the G20 and expressed confidence that the outcomes of the summit will advance shared goals.
President Joe Biden praised India's G20 presidency for further demonstrating how the G20 as a forum is delivering important outcomes. Prime Minister Modi and President Biden reiterated their support for building resilient global semiconductor supply chains. And the Indian and US leaders have agreed to deepen and diversify the Indo-US major defense partnership. Well, in recent years, there's been a significant shift in Indo-US relations, resulting in strategic collaborations between the two nations in various sectors, including defense. Jessica Taneja takes a look at the Indo-US ties.
From a formal banquet to addressing a joint session of Congress for the second time, Only a handful of visitors are given the sort of welcome that the Indian Prime Minister received in Washington 2 months ago.
Past few years, there have been many advances in AI, artificial intelligence. At the same time, there have been even more momentous development in another AI, America and India.
We are doubling down on our cooperation to secure our semiconductor supply chains, advancing Open RAN telecommunications networks, and growing our major defense partnership with more joint exercises, more cooperation between our defense industries, and more consultation and coordination across all domains.
Over the last 2 decades, there's been a major shift in the relationship over security and defense. Remarkably, for 40 years, India saw virtually no substantial military sales from the US. But today, it operates an impressive arsenal of American aircraft, helicopters, and drones. Soon, it'll have the jet engine technology, which the US shares only with its close allies. And there's other income too. Trade soared to $149 billion. Making the US its biggest trade partner in the last financial year. Jessica Taneja for DD India.
US President Joe Biden is hoping to use the G20 forum to offer developing nations more American engagement and funding. It would be an alternative to Chinese money, which has left many nations struggling to pay their debts. Nick Harper has more from Washington on this.
Chinese President Xi Jinping won't be attending this year's G20 summit, which could give US President Joe Biden an edge to sell his offer to the global south that the US is ready and able to help fund development. That, of course, at a time when China's economy is struggling and spending on its Belt and Road Initiative is drying up. It comes amid World Bank reform proposals, which could see hundreds of billions of dollars of funding for developing nations' climate and infrastructure plans. And Biden hopes that that will be a good selling point to offer a US-backed alternative to investment from Beijing. On top of that, the Russia-Ukraine conflict and climate change will also be key topics for Biden. And multilateralism will remain front and centre for the US president. The White House says the US aims to show that the world's economies can work together even in challenging times. But Biden leaves behind some bad headlines back at home. A set of new polling shows his approval rating has dropped to 39%. Many voters list his age, now 80, as the main factor. They do not believe he should seek re-election in next November's election. Another poll shows his potential rival, former President Donald Trump, is now just slightly ahead in the polls if the two men square off again for the White House next year. After the G20, Biden continues on to Vietnam to meet the country's leadership, before stopping off in Alaska on September the 11th to mark the 22nd anniversary of the 9/11 attacks on the United States. Nick Harper in Washington, reporting for DD India.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi held a bilateral meeting with his Bangladeshi counterpart Sheikh Hasina ahead of the G20 summit, with talks covering areas like connectivity and commercial linkage.
Prime Minister of Mauritius, Pravin Jugnauth, also hailed India's G20 presidency during his talks with India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi. With the leaders discussing cooperation in sectors like infrastructure, fintech and culture, Prime Minister Modi also reiterated India's commitment to furthering the voice of Global South.
Well, the 18th G20 summit begins today in the national capital, New Delhi. If we have put a question to the world leaders gathering for the G20, what would it be? Our correspondents went out and spoke to people from capital cities of different countries around the world to see what they think are the key issues that need tackling.
I still think that it should be gender pay gap. I think it's a little lagging behind of all the topics we are discussing in the G20 events. But it's still a thing like half of the population is women. So I think if we are doing something for the women, for the upliftment, so we are uplifting the half of the world.
First question will be how to join effort to stop the war from Russia with Ukraine. And second thing will be to raise inflation and cost of life.
I think that education always needs to be at the heart of what we're discussing, because with better education, people are able to empower themselves into better jobs, better living circumstances. That education is passed on to other people.
I would like them to debate about the world's economy, about peace, and most importantly about education, because without education, we're not getting anywhere.
All right, Anil, not to miss that the general populace of the countries participating in the G20 are also well aware of the issues. Not only the world leaders have come there prepared, but talking of the expectations, then people across the world have also expressed their expectations from the summit.
Well, you know, we've changed the perspective,
Yes.
especially when it comes to a G20. It's become more a public event, a festival that people think where the world leaders have converged here in the national capital to deliberate on the way forward to make this world a better place. Time for us to slip into a short breather here. On the other side, discussions and deliberations open on what we can expect in the next 2 days in the G20 presidency that India hosts, and world leaders get ready to talk and make some kind of sense.
Stay with us.
Namaste India.
Namaste land.
Marhaban ila al-Hind.
Zari India.
Salam India. Namaste India.
Namaskar Bharata.
Muy India.
Nahnu
Hunud. India. Ma Hindi Hasti. Mung Hindian.
Salam Hindustan.
We are India.
Swagatam to Andhra Pradesh, the coastal jewel of India. A state steeped in history. From the Gandi Kota Fort to the majestic Gondapalli Fort. A region known as the Rice Bowl of India. A holy land with rivers Krishna and Godavari flowing through it. Every part of this land tells a story of culture and devotion, and of a modern, developed, vibrant India. The graceful Kuchipudi and exuberant Dhimsa showcase the artistic brilliance of this land. The Ikkat and Kalamkari speak of the talent of artisans and their skilled hands. A cultural concoction that unites people in the spirit of Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam.
Welcome back after the break. This is the special edition on a G20 we're getting for you this morning. And we will be getting you details and what do we expect from G20 presidency. But before that...
Well, non-stop coverage here continues. As we mentioned, the next 48 hours, very crucial for India and the world. India's presidency, what can we expect? What could be deliberated? Important issues on the table as the world leaders converge here to talk, to rather walk the talk, especially when it comes to driving the world agenda. Meanwhile, foreign journalists who are there in the national capital, especially at the International Media Center, what do they feel, especially about the arrangements that have been made for the G20 summit by India? Let's listen in.
I'm surprised that there is a very
it's very very strong security guard around here, and it's a very comfortable place to work. Like, everything is good, the atmosphere is good, and very clean. Yeah, everything is neatly, so it's a very nice place, I think.
It's very comfortable. Actually, I'm surprised at how quiet it is. You know, you have so many people here together, but it's very comfortable and you can sit and work. So yeah, that's amazing.
Experience here so far has been all good. The food was very nice, vegetarian, everything was perfect. They have put out carpets on all the floors in here, which means that you're not bothered when people walk by you. Everything is working smoothly. It was easy to get here. It was easy to get in, and the security seemed like they have everything covered. So both safe, secure, and easy to get here. It was nice, all in all.
All right, the foreign delegates, they're all smiles on the arrangements that have been put in place, and India did not leave any stone unturned to ensure that the G20 is in fact a grand spectacle. To talk more about it, Mr. Atul Aneja, editor, India Narrative, is joining us this morning in the studio. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us on DD India this morning. A lot of expectations from the G20 summit, and eventually when we see it happening today, Prime Minister Modi had talked of how G20 is a catalyst for the new world order.
Absolutely.
Yes. Let's begin this talk with your analysis and your reading of this comment by the Prime Minister and how that is to be taken or that has to be brought to shape during this summit.
Absolutely. So we are the G20 summit is taking place after the COVID pandemic.
Yes.
So post-COVID world is a new world altogether. Where what the pandemic showed was that you cannot live in silos anymore, and that it has to be a collaborative world where there has to be no divide between, let's say, the global north and the global south. And G20 comes at a time when you sort of fuse this new model of having what the slogan says, one earth, one family, one future. Yes. So you cannot have any divisions anymore. So that's the basic template of what the new world order or the spirit behind the new world order should be. So that's one of the reasons but G20 is the first platform, I would say, or the first forum being held over here, where we're going to articulate this idea, this thought of a post-COVID world order, and sort of flesh it out during the deliberations which are going to take place. Now, what would that mean? That essentially means getting the global south integrated into the global discourse. And that is going to be the focal point of this summit. How are you going to get the global south into it? Now, then you work downstream about it. One is many countries, especially in the global south, were debt-ridden because of the economic catastrophe which accompanied the pandemic. And now that means many of these countries have gotten into huge debts, and that debt restructuring has to be done. Now, if that restructuring has to be done, then the global financial institutions also have to be restructured and sort of rejigged. And that's where institutions like the World Bank, IMF, they've all got to dovetail into the new requirements of this new global order. Okay. So that'll be one area, finance, which will come into the picture. Climate change is hitting everyone. Yes. So these are broad global issues which are of relevance to the entire world, and this is the forum, this G20 forum, which is going to address all these huge concerns in an integrated manner, and India is taking leadership in this.
Okay, Mr. Aneja, looking at the opening remarks that world leaders before their departure, or leaders that have come here and have expressed their views, let's begin with the UN. The UN chief, citing an alarm once again that not much is done on climate change. But having said that, all the commitments that developed countries made with regards to 100 billion being allotted every year, that's still not, there's no pen to the paper, especially when it comes to those numbers. So at the end of the day, do you see climate change to be the driver, especially when it comes to world leaders talking of putting money there to save the climate, considering the heat that we are facing at this point of time?
Anil, that is a key issue, which is climate change and how do you arrest it. Now, you talked about global, now this can't come without global financing coming into the picture. And that's where the shortfall comes. $100 billion was pledged for this, but that's not come from the developed countries. And historically, it's a developed world which have been much bigger polluters. And per capita, if you say India is much smaller compared to the 16% of the population, which is in the global north. So it was on that basis that this funding was supposed to come because of historical reasons from the global north into climate. But that $100 billion per year has not come. There's been a shortfall. So that's going to be a big issue about the funding shortfall which is going to take place. I think we need about $4 to $5 trillion per year till 2050 to transition into a green economy. Now that's where you commit. How are you going to get it? Are the governments going to fund it? That's where the banking infrastructure, which is multilateral banks, are going to come in. Are you going to have government-led approach, or the private sector is going to come into it? Are you going to have new instruments, blended instruments, which are going to make up for the shortfall? So these are going to be huge challenges, the funding challenges which are going to take place. And this particular summit is definitely, this is going to be one of the prime areas where discussions and deliberations are going to take place. I do hope that at the end of the day, we do get a roadmap is to convert the pledges into concrete action.
All right, when we talk of G20 as a forum, now it started as an economic forum, which eventually, was advanced to summit level talks. Now when we see it as a forum, we have, countries participating, spanning east and west of the world. We have developing countries sharing the stage with developed countries. When, as a forum, this will witness the different concerns of developing countries and the developed countries. How difficult is it a task for India as the president to make a balance, to achieve a balance in addressing the concerns of the developed world and the developing country? How tough, or for that matter, is it a Herculean task up the sleeves of the Indian government when we talk of G20 presidency? To what extent is it?
I think it's a huge challenge, but also a big opportunity.
Yes.
I mean, I do look at it, the positives of it, because what's happened is that we are truly in a globalized world. We are in a digital world. We are one, united. I mean, today I want to talk to somebody in Latin America, or you want to speak. I mean, you do go on the internet and do it. So in the sense that distances, in a way, have been erased, and we are all in it together. So that's the opportunity part which comes in, that you are in a seamless connected world right now. And so the concerns are common. I mean, for example, Anil talked about climate change issue. Now that's going to concern both the north and the south. So this is one area: debt restructuring, banking reforms. So it's no longer. I mean, we got to look at the world differently, not in terms of north or south, or quite honestly as one earth, earth really, and seek solutions together. So I do think there's a paradigm shift in the way of optics, in the way we are approaching the global system right now. And this is where now you come into concrete action, concrete plans of how to do your work sharing together and make sure that the entire planet progresses. There is no other way at all. And the pandemic showed it, that whether it is north or south, it hit all of us together. So I think there is a silver lining to the tragedy which took place, because our way of thinking has changed now. And that has to be advanced and demonstrated in terms of clear pathways and roadmaps. And that's where we are right now. And this is where the summit is. And now we'll go in various dimensions of it to make sure that we are in it together. But I don't see that problem of balancing north and south, because if you see even the statements of world leaders which came, it was with a collaborative spirit which we are seeing now, and not in terms of divisive or my way or the highway kind of approach we saw not very many decades ago.
Yes.
Well, clearly some positives that we that are there, that have taken place in the last 1 year, but we got to look forward to what could be the final outcomes or the final communique that comes out at the end of this particular New Delhi declaration that we look forward to. Lots to deliberate, still more to come, but let's focus and take a look at those VVIP movements that have taken place in the national capital. World leaders, as we mentioned, New Delhi is the fulcrum of all the world leaders now descending to India for this G20 summit, and Prime Minister Narendra Modi is expected to meet his British counterpart Rishi Sunak on Saturday. They are expected to discuss trade and other bilateral issues. The Indian origin leader touched down at New Delhi's airport on Friday. India has emerged as a leading economic partner of the UK, especially after Brexit, and there is a possibility of a free trade agreement. This is Sunak's first visit to India after taking over as Prime Minister of the country, and during his brief visit, Sunak may meet members of his extended family who live in Delhi.
All right, getting you an extension of this. Up next, we take a look at the India-UK relations.
The ties between India and the UK are defined by their shared history as well as cultural, economic and political cooperation. The UK is home to over 1.5 million British Indians, and the Indian diaspora is the country's largest ethnic minority community. In 2022, the role of this group gained renewed prominence globally after Rishi Sunak became the UK's first Prime Minister of Indian origin. The year also saw Indian students surpassing Chinese nationals as the largest group of foreign students in the UK. India is also the country's second largest source of foreign direct investment after the US. So it's not surprising that New Delhi and London have been working on a free trade agreement. The most recent trade negotiations between the two were held this month. An FTA means reduced tariffs on goods and services, and that will in turn facilitate an increase in exports. If signed, the deal will be a landmark for both the countries. Comprising 26 chapters, this will be one of the most comprehensive trade pacts between India and a Western nation. It will also pave the way for similar deals with countries like Canada. For the UK, the FTA will ensure easier access to a non-European market in a post-Brexit world. Having agreed on 19 of the total 26 FTA chapters, India and UK are closing in on finalizing the pact, whose negotiations began in 2021. Meanwhile, both the nations continue to make breakthroughs in investment. Earlier this year, India's Tata Group announced that it would invest over $5 billion to build an EV battery plant in the UK, making it one of the largest ever fundings in the country's automotive sector.
Well, British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is leading the UK delegation in New Delhi, where he's been dubbed India's son-in-law. On his journey, Sunak told journalists that India will be one of the most significant countries geopolitically over the next years and decades. Julia Chapman has more from London.
Rishi Sunak has travelled to India with his wife Akshata Murthy, whose parents are some of the richest people in India. Britain's first Prime Minister of Indian origin, a practicing Hindu, is visiting the country for the first time in his role. Prime Minister Sunak will meet with Prime Minister Narendra Modi on the sidelines of the G20 summit. Sunak says he wants to deepen ties with India, but that a trade deal is not a given. Negotiations are ongoing for a comprehensive free trade agreement aimed at giving a big boost to the exchange of goods and services between the UK and India. There had been hopes it would be signed in time for the summit, but British officials have downplayed that expectation. It's understood that progress has been made on reducing tariffs on British whiskey and cars and on Indian textiles, but there are still sticking points when it comes to British visas for Indian students and workers, as well as intellectual property on pharmaceuticals in India. Reports suggest that if talks go well in the coming weeks, Rishi Sunak could be back in India later this year to ink the deal and attend the Cricket World Cup. As for the G20 summit itself, Britain has several priorities. Among the highest is maximising political pressure on Russia for the war in Ukraine. London would like to see countries become less reliant on Moscow's energy exports. Prime Minister Sunak will also be seeking support for the AI Safety Summit that the UK is hosting in November. Sunak wants his country to become a leader in artificial intelligence and a powerful voice when it comes to setting global regulation for the industry. Julia Chapman in London, reporting for DD India.
All right, so that was about India-UK relations, and also to talk more about the G20 as an event and the day ahead, we're also joined in virtually by a guest, Dr. Swasti Rao, Associate Fellow from IDSA. Thank you so much, ma'am, for joining us this morning. Just a while back, we also had, a detailed analysis about this with our guest who's there with us in the studio. G20 as a forum where both developing world and the developed world share the stage. Now, let us understand from you, how important is this forum for the concerns of both the worlds to come together and the concerns be addressed? And talking of India's G20 presidency, how do you see that balance being achieved?
Right. A very good morning to you. And what a day, what a phase it's been for us. And before I start, my 7-year-old daughter has been very intrigued about what is happening in Delhi and why is Delhi so clean. And I had a ball of a time in explaining to her what is happening and how many world dignitaries are attending, the summit and are in New Delhi. And I showed her pictures one by one. So that was a very interesting, thing personally for me to actually try and tell this to a child as to why are we all so geared up and so excited about what is happening. So yes, indeed, on a more serious note, I've been following the kind of discussions that you've been happening, and your guest before me who was speaking on the value of how, the G20 has been formed, etc. I think let's start with the basics are very, very clear. The G20 is meant to be showcased for what it is. I think there seems to be sometimes now with the Ukraine war and everything, there seems to be this tendency to expect the G20 to come up with a joint communique or a joint declaration on a geopolitical problem, a security-related problem. But the G20 originally is not really equipped for it. What the G20 is for is that the G20 has been made to improve, to make the world's economic architecture more resilient, to make the world's banking systems more resilient. And for that, the G20 has a very, very, I would say, a very elaborate, a very developed structure of the finance tracks and the different engagement groups, through which they tackle different kinds of problems, especially that are related with, improving finance, improving climate financing. I mean, I was just hearing what Mr. Taneja was telling you, and I think he's completely on point when it comes to that. Where the problem happens is that because the G20 by nature is a group which brings together, and that is the beauty and the uniqueness of the group, that it brings together the developed and the developing world together on the same platform. So you have the G7. By the way, as we are meeting in Delhi, in Tokyo, there is a G7 speakers meeting also happening. So, I mean, you understand that there's a certain kind of a dynamic out there, which is going to be reflected in what the G7 expect and deliver at the G20. So, that interlinkage needs to be so to say, kept in mind. Now, like I said, that it is a grouping which has the G7, which is, the advanced economies of the world, along with Russia and China, and then the different other developing countries, especially the global south. And now that we have the African Union, now that it's official, now we know that it is also going to be a major platform for the developed countries to, to deal and to engage and tackle the global south, the emerging economies. Yeah.
Dr. Rao, especially when it comes to India, UK, FTA, that, both countries are looking forward to. Rishi Sunak stopped short of saying that, we are in the final stage. But do you see this final stage to be the most trickier one?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I'm glad you asked me this question because, we need to put this into perspective. You see, if this particular FTA comes through, Anil, this is going to be the biggest FTA that India has had with any country. And not just that, it is also going to pave the way for at least 2 other kinds of deals. And having one with that India is also in a very advanced stage of discussing an FTA with the entire European Union. Then what we don't know is that India is also negotiating another one with the European Free Trade Association, which is a 4-nation block of certain countries. And then we also have another one with Canada. Now, what I'm trying to tell you is that these are all linked together. And like you mentioned very rightly, that when it comes to the India UK FTA, there are a couple of things that we need to keep in mind. India UK FTA is also important for India because the trade we have with the UK is a trade where we enjoy the export surplus. So it is something which is going to be extremely important for us. I think the problem is that the remaining, I think there are about 26 chapters, and then about 19 or 20. Yeah, 19 are cleared. The ones that are remaining are more to do with mobility. And what India wants to push is that we really want a free flow of people. And now that is a thorny issue in the UK, because you heard what Suella Braverman a few months ago, when that became a huge controversy when she was sitting in the parliament there and said that we do not really want she said that Indian students and Indian people are the ones that overstay the visas, etc. And then there was a lot of clarification that followed from our side, which said that this is technically incorrect, etc. Now, what I'm trying to say is that this definitely is a thorny issue. This is going to remain a thorny issue, because you also then have to understand that for the domestic posturing of Rishi Sunak and his party, these are things for which these are the commitments that he has given to his electorate out there. So he can definitely not tweak from there too much. But having said that, it is a very important FTA for the UK as well, because it is, UK has been negotiating another FTA with the US, and that has also not really been going through. So, the UK economy is not doing very well. And for them, this is going to be a major win. So I think that a lot of headway has been made. There is a lot of political will. There is a lot of economic logic to it. And I think the two sides need to get together, that they are doing, obviously. And if sources are to be believed, I'm not very sure, because I'm also dependent mostly on what I get to hear, through different journalists, etc., and through all the reports that are coming from the two sides officially, which is that they could be completed by October or November. If you remember during Boris Johnson's time, if there was just so much talk of we being very close to the FTA, but the logic was that if it is not really getting you a good enough deal, what is the point of getting through with an FTA only for the heck of it? So that is what we are trying to avoid with the Sunak administration out there, and we're trying to get to a meteor deal.
Dr. Rao, we'll
sides.
ask you to hold that thought. At present, DD India correspondent Ollie Barrett is joining us from the G20 venue. Ollie, good morning. The stage all set, and we'll see the G20 summit beginning in some while from now. But the bilateral meeting which the Prime Minister had with US President Joe Biden is in fact also crucial. We will try getting back to Ollie Barrett. We are in fact told that there is some problem in the connection there. We'll try getting back to him again once he is there with us. Meanwhile, we are joined in by Mr. Atul Aneja. He is editor. Yes. So we were talking of, how important G20 is a forum. Now, this is also evident in the sense that Prime Minister has called for participation of African Union, and how the voice of Global South has to be aptly represented on this forum as well. And also how India is being seen through the world as the voice of Global South. But all this together, how does this platform provide the scope for this inclusivity?
Well, if you recall, before the G20 summit took place, or G20 meeting started, we had a conference of the Prime Minister with the Global South. There was that particular forum which was started, the particular dialogue with the Global South. In fact, that was part of a bigger plan of integrating the Global South in international forums. And that's where you see that a seamless progression taking place from that particular Voice of the Global South summit which took place earlier this year. And then if we look at the BRICS which took place, we got more countries coming in from the emerging economies in the Global South in terms of expansion. We have countries like Argentina, Egypt, etc., UAE, Saudi Arabia coming in. And then you see a further representation of the Global South now far more prominently and in a much more focused way in the G20. And so this is now the main thematic line of integrating the Global South with the global discourse. Now you mentioned specifically about the African Union. Now that's a huge development because African Union, I think the number of members, there are about 56 in it. So in fact, the voice of 56 countries is now being reflected in a top global forum, which is G20, and India has taken the initiative for it. Prime Minister Modi has personally gone out of his way to get the African Union into the
On
G20
board, yes.
on board. We have South Africa as well over here. So Africa is being represented big time for several reasons. A, it is the continent of the future in a way, in terms of resources which Africa has. Critical minerals, if we talk about, you know, the whole green economy, electric cars, it all banks on critical minerals, which have plenty. Now, but at the same time, Africa was always a resource-rich nation, but there was an exploitative nature with which these resources were exploited during colonial times. And if we see what we see in Niger, etc., is a reflection of that.
True.
So now we have to have a different win-win situation formulation, that while we do utilize the resources of Africa, but also we go back to Africa, industrialize Africa. Now, how is that going to do so? That is going to happen through forums like G20, which are now looking at global financing, which has to go into these global south and especially into Africa, and then see the revival, these as new engines of growth and development. There is a paradigm shift which is taking place from the north, global north to the global south.
Yes.
And this is the new world which is opening up. But it's a shared world. We are going to have these new engines coming up, but the so-called quote-unquote old world is also going to be a part of it in terms of technology. We've talked about Rishi Sunak over here. UK, for example, in fintech is very, very advanced. And that is something which we need to adapt to a situation, let's say a Comoros or a Niger or a Nigeria. So this is going to be the interdependence model, which we are going to see over here in far more focus than probably anywhere else. Somebody talked about, I think your earlier guest talked about the G7, very narrow. G20, far more representative, and also steering clear of geopolitical tensions. Let's focus on development, let's focus on growth, and new models with which to make it happen. So I think this is a very, very exciting time, a very exciting opportunity, really. And this is today and tomorrow are the days when this is going to happen, and the template is going to be, the foundations are going to be laid for this new world.
Mr. Aneja, do you see the possibility of maybe trying to get, especially the Black Sea grain deal that's fallen, post Russia not ready to renew it? Do you see a renewed push on the sidelines of the G20 summit, UK stepping in, trying to make Turkey, the partners that exist, convince Sergei Lavrov into coming back to the deal so that it could do a world of good to the world, especially when it comes to food grains?
Anil, that's a very, very important point, because if you talk about the Ukraine-Russia conflict, why are we so keen to get it resolved? Is essentially a global south angle which comes over here, because that's a grain, because the Black Sea area is one of the granaries of the world. And now that needs an outlet into global markets and into global south countries. And since we are emerging as a leader of the global south, it is in our interest that these tensions are diffused. You mentioned the StarCast which is coming over here. I mean, you have people from both sides of the aisle.
True.
You have Lavrov, you have Rishi Sunak. And that's going to be a big task for India now, to get a convergence on this, something which is minimum and which is very global south oriented, which is a grain deal or revival of a grain deal. Now that has to have certain implications in terms of conflict resolution. I think one follows the other. I think it could be a logical step here to take a bigger initiative from India, probably, to get the Ukraine-Russia tensions de-escalated, if not diffused. That process must begin. And I think the time is ripe here in New Delhi to start this together, that instead of a blame game, instead of, I am right and you are wrong, and, going along with complete hermetically sealed fault lines, you try and see the common ground which can appear, which is for the global good. And that becomes the basis for further de-escalating this conflict. And hopefully by a year or so, we might actually have that happening.
Okay.
But sir, if I would take that a little forward, now G20 as a forum is reflective of the concerns of the individual countries participating. And at the same time, we're talking of the international factors as well, which the world is facing at present, the international challenges. To some extent, these international, or for that matter, I would ask you, to what extent do these international factors play a role in, in taking forward the deliberations, taking forward the discussions when the world leaders sit together? The issues concerning the world are, at the same time put on table with respect to the individual concerns of the respective countries participating. So how is that to be dealt with?
How do they go hand in hand?
Yes,
how do they go hand in hand?
It's a tough ask. There is a contradiction here.
Yes.
Now, I read an article somewhere yesterday that, frankly, the problem is not protectionism for a revival of the global economy, but geopolitics. Now, if you're going to look at the world in geopolitical terms, then you are going to be, that's an old mindset of power politics. Now, that's not going to work in the post-COVID. That's the beginning of our discussion. We started talking about it. That this is a post-COVID global order which we are trying to define. This has no place for hard geopolitics, and that's going to be the problem now. That if you're going to focus on geopolitical tensions or exceptionalism, you would recall, when the Soviet Union collapsed, let's say 91. That was a time when unipolar world emerged, that we are the only pole of the world in the world. Now that era, finally, we are in a multipolar world now. It's a different ballgame altogether.
Okay.
So if you're going to look at geopolitics and not accept the new realities of multipolar world which needs to work in harmony, then we're going to go nowhere.
Mr. Anuja, we'll keep deliberating on all these issues. Let's also take a look at some other stories there, from the G20 summit. Next in line, Prime Minister Modi expected to meet his Japanese counterpart, Fumio Kishida, on the sidelines of the summit. Both the leaders have met on several occasions since Kishida became Prime Minister in 2021.
The friendship between India and Japan is rooted in historical and cultural ties. Over the years, the two nations have witnessed an increase in economic and defense cooperation. DD India's Ross Cullen reports.
India and Japan's ties are defined by their shared political, economic and strategic interests. Both countries are part of several international organisations, including the G20 and the Quad. Recent years have seen an upswing in high-level political engagements between India and Japan. In 2014, during Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to Tokyo, the two nations agreed to a special strategic and global partnership. The friendship between Modi and former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was also a reflection of the bond shared by their countries. Abe made a trip to the western Indian city of Ahmedabad, where he and Modi laid the foundation of the high-speed rail project linking the city to India's financial capital Mumbai. Japan provided nearly 80% of the project's funding. Declining health forced Abe to step down in 2020. In 2022, he, along with two other former Prime Ministers of Japan, met with Narendra Modi on the sidelines of the Quad summit in the Japanese capital. When Shinzo Abe was assassinated later that year, India declared a national day of mourning. His successors have carried on the legacy of strong cooperation with India. The current Japanese Prime Minister, Fumio Kishida, visited India last year for the 14th India-Japan Annual Summit. The visit saw Japan pledge a $42 billion investment in India over the next 5 years. Defence has also become an integral part of the relationship between the two nations, with a growing focus on the Indo-Pacific region. This year, India and Japan held their first air exercise at the Hyakuri Air Base near Tokyo.
Well, Japan will be looking to solidify its position as a world leader at the summit after successfully hosting the G7 earlier this year. Chris Gilbert reports from Tokyo on expectations of Japan from this G20 summit.
Well, Japan is entering this G20 summit fresh off hosting the G7 summit earlier this year, where all member countries united in their condemnation of Russia for the war in Ukraine, and in one voice to condemn any country which attempts to change the status quo by unilateral act of force with an eye on China. Japan is going to want to use this opportunity to expand that voice and get more countries on board with that message, as it is concerned that a Ukraine-type conflict could one day erupt in its own backyard. It also has domestic demographic problems. It is going to look to G20 member countries and invitees to make new agreements which will see more expats, more immigrants coming into Japan. Forecasts show that with a shrinking and declining population and workforce, that Japan is going to need over 15 years to more than double its current expat population to fill vital shortages in labor. However, there will be an elephant in every meeting and in every room, which is the global spectacle Japan just made last month by beginning the discharge of nuclear treated wastewater into the Pacific Ocean. China has been a vocal critic of that. It is likely to use the G20 summit to continue these complaints and criticisms. Japan is going to want to continue its campaign to try and glean understanding by explaining the safety of the discharge to member countries. It already has the US and South Korea on board. It is going to want to expand that list at this G20 summit. Chris Gilbert in Tokyo, reporting for DD India.
All right, from here we turn focus to Germany. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is arriving on Saturday to attend the G20 summit in the national capital. Prime Minister Narendra Modi is expected to hold bilateral talks with Scholz as well.
Well, staying with Germany, Germany is the world's fourth largest economy and Europe's largest. It comes to this year's G20 summit in New Delhi under the leadership of Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who had said he wants to use the gathering to strengthen partnership with Africa, Asia and Latin America. From Berlin, we've got DD India correspondent Trent Murray, who takes us through Germany's G20 priorities.
Well, Germany comes to this G20 summit at a time when Europe is facing a number of difficult issues on several fronts, most notably the war in Ukraine. It is a war that is deeply personal for Germany in many ways. Firstly, it's occurring not that far away geographically from the country's borders. There's also 1 million Ukrainian refugees living here, seeking shelter essentially from the conflict. And for that reason, we are being told that Chancellor Scholz will continue to try and rally support on the international stage for Ukraine, not just with some of those countries that are already supporting the country militarily, but we are told he wants to have conversations with the likes of Indonesia, Brazil and South Africa, effectively parts of the global south, in order to try and champion Ukraine's cause. Speaking of Africa, we also know that Germany goes into this summit supporting the Africa Union becoming a permanent member of the G20, just like the EU is. Again, we expect Chancellor Scholz to be very much supporting that a proposal when it's brought before other leaders. Promoting trade and commerce is another area we're being told that the Germans are looking at heavily. Of course, Germany is Europe's largest economy. It has a number of really important high-profile industries like the auto industry, for example. And there's a real push underway, not just here, but in other parts of Europe, for some of those big companies to start diversifying away from doing so much business with China and instead to de-risk by opening up to new markets and expanding. And it has to be said, India really is the top of the wish list in that cause. On the flip side, though, whilst economic growth is, of course, very important, we are also hearing from green and environmental groups very, very concerned about the rise in emissions. And so we are being told that Chancellor Scholz will have discussions at this summit around investing in renewable energy and also to try and push for other countries to move away from fossil fuels at a faster pace. It also just has to be said, and it's a bit of an unusual prospect that we may see, but the Chancellor will likely attend this summit with a very big eye patch on. It's certainly going to grab attention, and especially in those group photos with other world leaders. That is because he suffered an accident while he was out exercising last weekend. It's not a serious injury. He is taking many jokes about it. There's been plenty of pirate photos and the like made up in the German newspapers here. He stresses the injury is not serious. He's just waiting for that bruising to go down before he takes the eye patch off. In Berlin, Trent Murray for DD India.
And the ties between India and Saudi Arabia have existed for thousands of years due to trade. In recent times, the two nations have become economic and cultural partners. A detailed report ahead.
Relations between India and Saudi Arabia were established soon after the former gained independence in 1947. Presently, Saudi Arabia is India's fourth largest trading partner. The Gulf Kingdom is also among the top suppliers of crude oil to India. The ties between the two nations are not limited to economy. Nearly 2.2 million Indians live in Saudi Arabia, making them the largest expatriate community in the country. In a major boost to bilateral cultural ties, Saudi Arabia increased India's Hajj quota by 30,000 in 2019. The number now stands at 200,000 per year. India currently sends the second highest number of pilgrims for Hajj after Indonesia. High-level engagements between New Delhi and Riyadh have increased in recent times. In 2016, during his visit to Saudi Arabia, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi was conferred with the kingdom's highest civilian honor, the Order of King Abdulaziz. 3 years later, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman visited India. During the coronavirus pandemic, India provided 4.5 million Covishield vaccines to the kingdom in 2021, while Saudi Arabia sent liquid oxygen to India during the second wave of COVID. This year, the kingdom helped India evacuate its citizens from conflict-hit Sudan. As part of India's Operation Kaveri, the evacuations were carried out via Saudi Arabian port of Jeddah, where a transit facility was set up. In August, Saudi Arabia became one of the 6 countries that have been invited to join Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, or the BRICS group, in 2024.
Well, deliberations here continuing. We've still got Dr. Swasti Rao with us, Associate Fellow from IDSH, who's been there during these deliberations. Swasti, looking at the 3 bilaterals that the Prime Minister had last evening, began with Mauritius, Bangladesh, and culminated with the United States of America. The most important of it, the United States of America, purely in terms of achievables that the 2 countries have managed, any big ticket pushes that you see that have taken place when the 2 leaders met?
Well, yes, Anand, and that's what all eyes were at, that very important bilateral that we were having with the US. Also because the 2 leaders have met several times over, in the last 1 year, especially in 2023. But it was, for Joe Biden, it was the first visit as the US president to India, and that also made it special. I think the big ticket, there was hardly anything to be announced per se, but I think the deal, we have already had some landmark agreements with America, especially on the factor of the GE and the HAL electric, the 414 engine deal. True. Then we have the Predator drone deal, yes. And then we have the ISET, which is the critical and emerging technology understanding between India and the US. And I guess the 4th one is to do with how to develop the global South. So I think, and also the civil nuclear cooperation, that we have had with America in the 2005. I think what we were doing yesterday there, we're still waiting for a joint statement to emerge from there. But I think what we were doing is that we were now fine-tuning a lot of issues around those very complicated deals, especially with regard to the 414 jet engine deal. Now it has the Congress approval. So now, since it has the Congress approval, now we can get into the details and the nitty-gritty of the transfer of technology conditions, etc., etc. So that was one. About the Predator drone deals, there is still some negotiation to be done on getting the best price. So I think those were the more important, the more fine-tuned details of the already landmark agreements that we have had with the US. But what is the more important thing, in my opinion, it does not lie in the details as much, but lie in the larger message that is sending across. See, we have to somewhere understand that what we are doing with the US today is going to genuinely shape the contours of our geopolitical capabilities in the coming times. There are 3 kinds of world orders in the world today. That's the way I try to project it, which is there is a global security order where the United States is still a hegemon. There is a global economic order where, of course, there's far more multipolarity because there is a bloc which is led by China. There's a rise of the middle order powers, and of course, there's the US too. And then there's an emerging global digital order. And the fact is, the realization is that whoever is now coming together to shape the norms and the standards of the global digital order is going to have an edge whenever it comes to the global economic order or the global security order. So the point that I'm trying to highlight here for you is that without having this, critical emerging technology, without having this joining of hands and trying to get to shape the emerging architecture around the digital order, we would not be able to. I mean, not just we, no country would be able to have that influence in the economic or the security order. And I think since we have already entered into, such an important agreement with the US for that, that is really going to affect our geopolitical capabilities in times to come.
All right, Ms. Rao, you stay with us, but at present we'll tell our viewers more about India-UAE relations now. The United Arab Emirates and India are forging a strong alliance as G20 and COP28 leaders. And also, this means paving the way ahead for a sustainable global agenda. Let's take a look at this report. Or we'll get to that report in a while from now. But before that, we'll turn focus to the next country with which India is, in fact, forging ahead when we talk of the relations. But before that, again, we'll get you more visuals on this. The relationship between India and Mauritius here. We have Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi holding bilateral meeting with Mauritius Prime Minister Pravind Jugnauth.
Mr. Aneja, they're still with us. Mr. Aneja, when one sees the larger picture with regards to a communique at the end of the deliberations over the next 48 hours that we see, do you see light at the end of the tunnel, that there is a New Delhi declaration that comes into play?
I think so, and I hope so. The reason why I think this might happen is because the convergences which have taken place on the global development agenda. I think that trumps everything else. And so there are good chances that countries which have very strong views, let's say in the situation in Ukraine or Russia, are likely to bury their concerns in the G20, keep the spirit of G20, which is more geo-economic than geopolitical, and keep the sanctity of this forum. I hope it does happen, Anil, and I can even say it's likely to happen.
Okay. And also, do you see the likelihood of where the things stand, Do you see the likelihood that the West is going to push, especially for, a forum like this come together for a humanitarian aid package to help Ukraine in this time of crisis? Do you see the possibility that that could be flagged in this particular G20?
You see, Anil, if you look at the humanitarian side of it, I think that's an area of convergence with everyone else. True. So that is something which it's quite possible that might happen. And India itself has been one of the donors to Ukraine when it comes to humanitarian aid. So that's again a common point among all the countries which comprise the G20.
Okay.
Yes, we are getting you the live exclusive coverage on G20, and we have been getting analysis from the guests who've joined us. We have with us Mr. Atul Aneja in the studio, and we're joined in by Ms. Swasti Rao. She is virtually joining us. Dr. Rao, when we talk of this G20 as a forum and the declaration, we'll also talk about G20 presidency of India. A number of new initiatives have been introduced in the G20 when we talk of the startup, the push to startup. Startup 20 has been started. There is more focus on women-led development. There is more focus on cybersecurity to tackle the threats. And also we've seen how, all right, we'll get back on that question, but...
Live visuals coming there of the German Chancellor coming for the G20 summit. Olaf Scholz there. Well, that particular band that he's having on his eye of wearing an eye patch is because the German Chancellor just a week ago hurt himself while jogging, and that's the result that he's got that eye patch. But the German Chancellor is excited, especially about this particular visit to India, and looks forward to the next 2 days of deliberations in making this world a better place to live in.
Yes, indeed. When we talk of India-Germany relations, then India is one of the first countries, in fact, to have ended the state of war with post-war Germany, and since then the relationship has strengthened between the two countries. India and Germany have a strategic partnership since 2001, and also over the years we've seen how the relationship has grown and strengthened and flourished as well. So we have German Chancellor Olaf Scholz landed in the national capital for participating in the G20
Well, Mr.
summit.
Scholz there, as I mentioned, suffered those injuries.
Yes.
That's why that eye patch is there. But he's been a real sport. He's shared a picture of himself on X, and he's thanked the people for the well wishes, and he's also excited about all the memes that are followed with it. But he's enjoyed his time, especially with that injury and that black patch that people have been talking about. And the post that he's put on X has garnered close to 9,000 likes and more than 2,000 comments. So we could look forward to that particular image of the German Chancellor standing out. But clearly they're here for serious deliberations in this G20 summit. We're going to slip into a short breather here. On the other side, we're still going to go live to Bharat Mandapam. Our reporters are there on ground zero. We're going to get cut across live to them.
Yes.
All this and lots more on the other side of this short break. Stay with us. Don't go anywhere.
Wherever news breaks, whatever it takes.
Connecting corners, cutting across continents.
Stories that matter from across the globe.
Accurate, authentic journalism that serves you right. From politics to glamour, from sports to world affairs, with a fusion of aesthetics and substance. Introducing news in a new avatar. Experience the world through a new lens. Stay tuned to DD India for an exciting journey beyond borders.
Welcome back after the break. You're watching this exclusive broadcast on G20, and from here we turn focus to our correspondents who are there stationed at the Bharat Mandapam to get us live inputs from there. Sakal Bhatt and Shubhendu join us in fact from the International Media Centre.
Well, good morning, Sakal. Good morning, Shubhendu.
You're watching this very special broadcast on DD India, the D-Day, historic, unprecedented, when all eyes across the globe are all set on national capital New Delhi here in India. The 18th edition of G20 summit under India's or Bharat's presidency. I'm Sakal Bhatt, and with me is my colleague Shubhendu Ghosh, and we're bringing to you this very, very special broadcast from the very G20 venue. These are DD India studio setup, and we're going to transmit live visuals, live pictures, analysis, and what really makes this G20 summit under India's presidency absolutely historic, unprecedented, and people's summit.
Absolutely. Thanks, Sakal. Good morning and welcome to the venue of the G20. Over 220 meetings all through the year across 60 cities and locations of India. All of that has led to this day, the beginning of the G20 Leaders Summit. 2 days of high-octane negotiations where the leaders of the G20 countries, invited countries, are going to determine the road ahead for global economy, of the world order in many ways. And this is the place, the venue from where we'll get you all the action non-stop. This is a special coverage of the G20 you're watching on DD India. And also joining us here is Professor Sriram Cholia, expert on international affairs. Good morning and welcome, sir. Big
all
day.
Smile and beaming, Sriram.
Yes, and when we look at those 220 meetings, all the outcomes, so many rounds of negotiations, all boils down to how the leaders now articulate the way forward. How do you see these 2 days?
Yes, Shubhendu, this is the climax, and we are here, and I think it's a red letter day for India to be hosting this, and the scale and the ambition with which we have organized this G20 is just unprecedented. Sakal was saying, that this is historic. I don't think we are exaggerating.
No, absolutely not.
29 heads of delegations from countries, 14 international organizations, including the UN Secretary General. Who is who of international diplomacy is in New Delhi. And I think our convening power, you see, as a host, for a country to be able to draw in so many heavyweights from all over the world at our, right here, and to deliberate on global issues, it shows the rise of India. And I think that's what we are seeing under Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Our diplomacy has gone from being a middle power to a rising power that's going to become a leading power in the world. This G20 summit is ultimately going to be a milestone in our pathway to becoming a leading power in the world.
Just to understand, broadly speaking, what are various facets which actually sets this G20 different from the previous ones? The 17 G20 summits, I'm sure you must have covered few, we've covered some. It seems the whole world not only is looking at India, but the who's who of the world's politics is converging here in India today.
Sakal, first, like we said, scale. In scale, it's massive, right? Prime Minister always said, "Bada socho," think big, and do something extraordinary and historic. That's what we are doing. Second, I would say the agenda is very, very development centric. The previous G20 presidencies have also tried to bring in a lot of development content and the working groups, mechanism. There's so many issues in G20, but we have put in a way developmental issues, developmental priorities of those who are not part of G20 also on the table. Voice of the Global South. I would say that is the distinguishing feature of this G20 compared to previous ones. And third, I would say that the kind of new innovations and ideas that India as the chair and also the other G20 participants have brought in are going to make this a richer experience. We'll see this when the final declaration comes also. Just the depth of issues. I mean, there's so many technical areas and I don't understand half of them, but overall what I can say is that we are actually, global governance is at stake, right? There's no unanimity in the international community. There are a lot of divisions, a lot of conflict. So this G20 is a make or break.
The timings is also important.
Pardon?
The timings of the summit.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So this is a make or break moment. We were with the External Affairs Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, the other day on DD, and he was saying this is an inflection point in global politics.
And he also said that, if you remember, Shubhendu, that exclusive interview that Sriram got is, India has to be world ready, but most importantly, world has to be India ready. And I think that's a very important statement. And that kind of sums it up, that when we talk about the G20 format or scheme of things, it just cannot get bigger than this, especially under India's presidency. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think, see, the country, of course, is very much willing and ready to take global responsibilities. That is the number one message we are sending to the world. And Sakal and Shubhendu, here at the G20 venue, there are like hundreds of delegates from all over the world. And when we talk to them, they're all saying this is just so massive. You people have taken G20 so seriously. Our countries have also hosted G20, but we never did it on such a grand scale. It means that India is actually thinking about world welfare.
Right. Professor Choli, I want to talk about that scale aspect a little more. Yesterday, when the Sherpa was giving a briefing to the media, he spoke about over 220 meetings across 60 cities and venues, and that's also unprecedented because traditionally the countries hosting G20 would have it in the capital, maybe a city adjoining the capital, one or two venues. 60 cities across the length and breadth of the country, from Kashmir to Kanyakumari, from Gujarat to Northeast to Port Blair. I'm not exaggerating symbolically, I'm not speaking. These are actually were the destinations among 60. What message does that send across within the country and outside?
Within the country, like I said, it means that India's time has come. We have arrived on the big stage, and all our people, our society, was mobilized to back the government and the state to be able to deliver on this. See, domestic credibility matters. If there have been some G20 hosts which are not even democratic, they don't even do this kind of mass exercise of what Prime Minister calls Jan Bhagidari and people's participation. But we are the world's largest democracy, and among the developing countries, I would say it is the most successful democracy. So we are showing to the world that this is the right model of consultation and participation for governance. And the good governance that we have at home in India is a model for the rest of the world in terms of global governance. These are not two separate. As far as the outside world goes, they are seeing that Indians have, owned the G20. Indians took stakeholdership of G20. Indians took responsibility for the G20. And they are saying, these are the kind of people who should lead the world order. The new world order should be under Indian leadership. That is the big message, I think, that we are also hearing from so many delegates. And I can tell you, they are not trying to flatter us. There are many, many serious scholars I've been meeting here at the venue who are saying, I've attended 15 summits, 10 summits, 12 summits, and I've never seen the depth of preparations, the kind of engagement that you Indians have done.
Right.
You know, it's like you're lifting the whole of humanity, as PM said, human-centric globalization.
Yeah, that is exactly lifting of whole of humanity is what is reflected in our very ethos or the vision or the theme of the G20 when we talk of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which we have derived from Sanskrit Upanishads, the heritage, Indian heritage, which is so much embedded, Indian culture. I think there are more than the diplomatics or diplomacy aspects to G20, which have been traditionally part of such for us, Sriram. But this time also when we talk about why this is unprecedented and historic, because we have seen, Shubhendu, you've covered in fact some of those engagement groups and meetings. In the last 1 year or so, the way culture has been reflected in most of these engagement sessions, meetings, extensive briefings, which also adds a lot to India's soft power.
A broader message of inclusivity, which talks about India's own cultural diversity, which is showcased in the manner in which the cities are planned, but also in the message, as you mentioned, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, globalization, which is human-centric, globalization, which makes space for emerging economies, developing economies, global south, and it's interesting that the Global South Summit precedes the G20 engagements of India. That sends out a big message, Professor.
Yeah, on the culture issue, Shubhendu and Sakal, I'll say that, you know, the greatness of India has been showcased in a way like never seen before. You know, the whole world, we had Incredible India and all those tourism promotion thing, but even here at the venue, you see India, mother of democracy, there's a full tableau about it. You know, all our art forms, our cultural, our handicrafts, all are on display here, you know, for the whole world. And then there is also the modern things we're doing, like our digital success, you know, and digital public infrastructure is a major issue at this G20. And we got a whole pavilion here in the Bharat Mandapam on that. And all these are, in a way, you know, G20 is like a showcase and or some window to the world where we are saying, come on in, look at the greatness of India, and we are there to support each other, and our you know, attributes are, you're most welcome to benefit from our attributes. That is a sign of a rising power, because middle and small powers, what they do is they are always looking up to somebody else, to some richer countries or more powerful countries to be their role model. Here, through our culture, through our engagement with Global South and all these things, what we are saying is, you know, we are the model. And I'm not, you know, being bombastic here. We are the model, and we have shown this through good governance and through innovation and through all these, you know, by representing our depth of our diversity of our culture.
Just to add a bit more to the heritage bit, also this is pretty much in tandem with Prime Minister's vision of Virasat Bhi or Vikas Bhi, that how heritage and development can go hand in hand. Have you, I mean, in your journalistic or scholarly experience, do you remember any of the summits or international platforms where heritage of the host country or any region for that matter has been showcased to the world on such a massive scale?
Sakal, no, the answer is no. Nobody has done it as well as India. And I'll tell you something else. You know, the authentic India is coming to the fore. India is becoming Bharat, you know, and that is on display here. That is part of the entire last 1 year of our G20 presidency. People have always wanted this kind of India that's confident about its own identity, not which is confused, you know. And so that has come to the fore through this cultural, you know, extravaganza and through the outpouring and the participation of people and the display of our art forms. And what that is doing is, this is the India people always wanted, meaning the world. And they wanted to see this kind of India that, you know, its ancient civilization, its historical pedigree, all these have to come to the fore. And while we are doing a lot of things which are very contemporary and which of course are part of the G20 agenda, we use this as a big opportunity. I think Prime Minister's vision was, this is, you know, to put India on center stage of world affairs, and not just India as in modern India. We are bringing the whole concept of Bharat and civilization to the fore, where people should appreciate that this is a country that gave solutions for millennia for international problems. And we are again doing it through G20 in the 21st century.
And lifestyle
for
mission,
environment, the vision that Prime Minister puts forth. What kind of centrality does it occupy when we talk about the larger message of sustainable development, climate change? These are right at the center of all the conversations that we're having.
Shubhendu, the slogan for the G20 India presidency is One Earth. It starts with Earth. Yes. Then one family.
Then one future.
One future. Earth is the number one thing, and I think we have credentials because it's not just empty slogan. You know, we have fulfilled our Paris Climate Accord commitments far ahead of all the other G20 member countries. It's a fact, and it's recorded. The UN has acknowledged it. We are going faster towards renewables. Lifestyle for environment is a positive message. It's not only about cutting carbon emissions. That is one debate, and they're going to be, squabbling over it in the G20 also. But the larger thing, the Prime Minister's vision is something positive for the world, which everybody, every individual, 7 billion plus people on the planet.
That's the point we want to emphasize, Professor, about making individual the stakeholder into the climate change initiatives, individual communities, which earlier was a concern that countries and governments and leaders would debate over. Now, individuals and communities also have a stake in what happens to our future.
That's the reason why our G20 presidency, we are calling it a people's presidency.
Yes.
It's not a state elites only. Of course, the presidents, prime ministers, UN Secretary General, they're all here, and we are proud of the fact. But I'll tell you, below the level of the state, below the level of, there are private corporations. We need buy-in. They have to be big stakeholders for any of this to work. Non-governmental organizations, civil society, education, health.
You name it, and
all the sectors have to be involved.
Trade,
for the G20
health,
agenda
education, taxation, everything. Adding to that environment bit, Life Mission, like you just mentioned, this G20 under India's presidency is not confined only to the heads of the states and the elites, but it's about the people. And this whole Life Mission, which again was launched by our Prime Minister, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, kind of promotes healthy, environment-friendly lifestyle at the individual level and at the national level. So that's also how you really bring in people into the whole system of international diplomacy.
Yes, Sakal, there is a phrase, elite multilateralism, which basically means, powerful people and powerful organizations and institutions getting together in a closed door, behind off camera and doing some deals, right? What we have tried to do is a reverse of that. Of course, that will also happen in G20, inevitable as part of the traditional diplomacy. But our public diplomacy has been outstanding. What we have said is, like you said, the stakeholders are not only 20 countries, meaning 20 governments or 19 governments and EU. And 9 more invitees. The stakeholders are 7 billion people, including those who are from non-G20 member countries, Absolutely. So to be able to have a responsibility and a vision for such a broad canvas for whole of humanity, for the whole planet, that requires some vision, I must say. And it's not only vision, execution also. And there, of course, we will do our utmost as the chair, but it also depends on cooperation and follow through and implementation by all the member countries. That ultimately the commitments that they make in every G20 have to be fulfilled. On average, the researchers are saying 71% of commitments in previous G20 presidencies have been met by all the countries.
Okay.
So it's we need to be relatively optimistic about G20. It's not like they're just signing on a paper and saying, okay, we are done with the drama or the show. It's more than a show.
Russia-Ukraine conflict, there were always, like we've seen in the last 1 year or so, questions being raised about India's stand, and India has maintained a very neutral position that it stands with peace and all of that. But the way India balanced it, in that context, the South-South cooperation persuaded by our Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and how that is going to come up directly or indirectly in the summit.
Sakal,
because it's not really going to be an easy cakewalk on various issues. Would you agree?
It's not. I'll say a couple of things. First, we have two instruments to be able to push everyone for consensus. Number one, we have strong bilateral strategic partnerships with many of the G20 countries, right? We have built them up assiduously year after year after year through our diplomacy. So that is going to be high value, our bilateral partnerships. So suppose there is a country X, let's be diplomatic, let's say country X, let's not name anybody, who is saying, I don't like this paragraph or this sentence and this wording, and I'm not going to sign on to it. We have a strong bilateral partnership with them, right? Our prestige is at stake. They can't rain on our parade because we have given so many things to them when they were hosting their events, and also bilaterally, in economic and in strategic matters. So that's the number one. We're going to use all those skills here. It's not only a multilateral setting, it's also the host's one-on-one equations with so many countries who are here. Second, I would say the issue of the South, it should be a conscience issue. That's what Prime Minister said. You may be the richest country in the world and you are objecting to, let's say, let's say climate change. Let's say country Y is not happy with the wording on the climate change part of the, declaration, saying, you are pushing us too hard and it's not fair. Every country should contribute to this. Why only rich countries are being asked to contribute? Let's say. Again, the question is, who is watching you? It's not only your own country and your own people or your own, finance ministry that has to shell out money. 7 billion people are watching you, and their expectations are on your. Do you want to go back with the conscience that you spiked the whole process and you made it a failure? No. So I think we're going to use these two, persuasion and partnership.
So about the consensus building, just because we're talking about the consensus building, where India takes the lead on these sticky, rather precarious issues. One we are talking about, Russia-Ukraine, and then you have climate. You have to walk the talk. We did, but we have to persuade others also. The challenges that are there.
Yeah, of course, there's a saying, that when the going gets tough, the tough gets going. So it is a very, very, challenging task. It's a huge responsibility on our shoulders, and we have willingly taken it up. And I think we can be quietly confident that we have worked the wheels. We have, been able to establish, our clarity on our positions, but also finding a middle ground among all these contending countries, some of whom don't see eye to eye. What we have tried our utmost is depoliticize. That's the key word. Depoliticize a lot of issues, which are actually for the common good of all. So if we can think about a depoliticization agenda and keep the bilateral bad blood out of G20 as much as possible. Don't use G20 as a forum for boxing. Against each other. Use the G20 where we all really hold hands. There is going to be a group picture, right? The group picture, literally and virtually, we need to hold hands together. Otherwise, the world is doomed.
And what kind of a challenge does that offer, Professor Cholia, politicization of a multilateral forum like this? Let's go back a year. Let's talk about the Indonesia edition of the G20. We know that similar challenges, the pandemic, the Ukraine war, but also the challenges were dividing countries into poles, and India was said to have played a key role in building consensus. Just take us through what were the key points there and the manner in which India took the countries forward, and therefore, now that India is heading and is the president of the G20 this year, how can it take those strategies forward as well this year?
Indonesia, we were not the host. So there, the dynamic was that we actually engaged with the Western countries, especially the US, and the Americans came out publicly later on saying it's credit to India that we agreed. So, there was this issue about the wording of the Ukraine paragraphs. I believe we made a major contribution there. There was issue on climate. There were a number of other, such technical issues on trade facilitation, on digital, all these things. Lots of issues where there were disagreements. So what we tried to do there was being a constructive kind of a broker among these multiple players in such a way that we get consensus. And this time I believe we are stronger because as a host, while the responsibility is more, we also have more power. And we have persuasion power, and we have, there's also the question of linkage. What normally countries do in group diplomacy is, okay, I give you this on this point, but what will you give me back on something else that I want, maybe in another section of the declaration, or something totally unrelated to this, That's why I said strategic partnerships.
Quid pro quo in strategic partnerships.
Yeah, of course.
India, so just to understand this further, India, as we speak now, under the current ruling dispensation, has the power of bargain.
Yeah, I know, and definitely our word counts more, our commitments count more, and our pressure and persuasion also count more than
What do you
before.
think has brought in that change over the last few years?
See, first of all, people are seeing this is the fastest growing economy, major economy in the world. Among all these G20 who are here, many of them are facing recession, economic headwinds. India is growing 6% or more, projected to grow 7% or more. So that is number one for all of them to say, okay, here is a leader who is talking. India is not a burden on the world. India is actually giving something to the world, and is going to be the growth engine. By the way, contribution to global growth, China used to be the engine. No more. It's India. So what I'm trying to say is that gives us heavier weightage in all these negotiations, because they are going to benefit from India's growth. let me put it this way, going back to the quid pro quo point, market access to India. If they play spoil sport, we are not going to be kind to them. I'm sorry, international diplomacy is also based on reciprocity, right? So, I mean, to put it in a crude way, they better behave, because otherwise it will have repercussions. And I think when India threatens repercussions, it's also to be taken seriously.
Was this sort of confidence missing in previous governments? I may ask this.
Well,
because we need to understand where are we really coming from, the trajectory in the last 9 to 10 years and before that. Not really comparing, but just to understand.
We were a lot weaker, Sakal.
Now India is at the global high table, and when Prime Minister Modi talks, he is not only seen as India's Prime Minister, but one of the world leaders, and I think that is the message.
That's the message. And, we were weaker in earlier eras. We were much smaller. We're going to be a $4 trillion economy very soon, and the third largest in just a few more years. So, if you look at the lineup, the top three, China, United States, and India, these three are going to be the top three powers in the world, in time to come. So, what does that mean? Nobody can take us for granted. Nobody can take us lightly. And I think that reflects. There are also other things, the partnerships, our defense and security relationships, our role as a net security provider in Indo-Pacific, in our developmental partnerships in Africa, in the rest of the global south, all those also add up, So I think the time of talking is over. What we have done in the last 10 years, we have done a lot, on the ground.
And it's time for the action. And Professor Cholia, we'll have to toss it back to the studio in a bit. It's an economic grouping, G20 primarily. Key issues, very briefly, sir, that this presidency of India will be focusing on, very briefly, the pointers.
Number one, it's a development-centric G20, as we spoke about. I think there's going to be a lot of emphasis on digital public infrastructure, where we can give a lot to the world. Our innovations, our social innovations can really transform the socio-economic conditions around the world. I would say climate, obviously, we already discussed, that's a major one. There's also focus on trade and also SDGs. How we can, and the sustainable development goals.
Growth.
Absolutely. And I would say also here, there needs to be macroeconomic coordination. What is happening is, if a country B raises its interest rates, it has an impact on country C and country D, and they do it unilaterally without consulting with the others, especially countries which have got significant financial power. We want all of them to be on a same page in a coordinated manner.
And more collaborative.
Because otherwise, something done in some capital should not bring about misery thousands of miles away in an interconnected
And not
world.
to forget the women-led development.
Absolutely. I'm just coming to that. With due respect to the lady in the studio. But with that, we'll have to now toss it back to the studio. This was just a broad outlook of what G20 is all about. We're here at the G20 venue. We'll keep coming back here, getting you all the latest action and developments as they happen. But for now, Anil, it's over to you.
Well, thank you, Shubhendu. Thank you, Sakal, for that, your thoughts with the expert there, Sriram Cholia, talking about how India is taking strident steps, especially with regards to this particular G20 summit. And will this have a change in the dimension, especially when it comes to international trade? We're going to deliberate on that on the other side of the short breather. Stay with us. Don't go anywhere. News and updates on G20 on your channel, DD India.